It was supposed to be just another quiet day for Lewis McCann. A silent man, with tired eyes and calloused hands, trying to bury a past no one in that town knew. But fate doesn't forgive men like Lewis, and when a group of outsiders crossed the gates of his property to force his family out, thinking they could take everything by force, they made a fatal mistake, because what they didn't know was that this man was not just a farmer. Lewis had faced hell before, and hell had never defeated him. Now they wouldn't just be fighting for land, they would be fighting to survive. But the question is, will any of them make it out alive?
Hi, here's Mark. Before we begin, please comment about where you're watching from and what you enjoy most about our stories. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to do it so you don't miss our next stories. Tomorrow, we have an amazing one waiting for you. Thanks for being here. Now, let's dive into today's story.
Morning sunlight bathed the fields of Thunder Creek in a golden hue, and a gentle breeze made the wheat fields dance softly under the rising light. Lewis McCann held a piece of weathered wood in his calloused hands, examining the rusty nails that had once kept the farm's fence sturdy. The structure was old, but he didn't care. His distant gaze swept over the property as if measuring time by its cracks and patches, each broken fence telling a story of years gone by. To anyone watching, he was just an ordinary farmer, but inside his mind there was a silent battlefield, a place where the sounds of war still echoed. Martha watched her husband from the porch, wiping her hands on her flour-stained apron. She recognized that lost look. That way he analyzed every detail around him as if he were waiting for something that never came. It was a shadow of the man who once left for war and who, despite returning, had never truly come back. The Lewis she once knew was young and full of life, a man who laughed loudly and loved dancing with her in the kitchen, even without music. The Lewis who came home after 22 years of military service was silent, methodical, and bound by habits no one understood, and as hard as she tried to reach what was left of him, she could never fully touch him. 17-year-old Ethan stepped out of the house, adjusting his backpack strap on his shoulder, his heavy footsteps breaking the morning stillness. He watched his father for a moment, frowning at the sight of him standing there, deep in thought, holding that piece of wood as if it were something important. To Ethan, Lewis was an irritating mystery, a man of few words and a hard expression, someone who never showed weakness, never complained, and never seemed human. All of his friends' fathers told funny stories from their youth, taught them how to fix cars or play football. His father simply existed there, like a living statue, unchanging and untouchable. "Need money for gas," the boy said, breaking the silence, arms crossed impatiently. Lewis blinked a few times before answering, as though coming back. From a distant place, he reached into the pocket of his worn jeans and pulled out a folded bill, handing it to his son without a word. Ethan took the money and sighed. He wanted more. He wanted his father to ask where he was going, to lecture him about not speeding, to show any kind of interest in his life. But Lewis just went back to staring at the fence, as if his son were nothing but another piece of scenery. "Thanks, I guess," Ethan muttered, turning on his heel and heading to the old pickup parked in the yard. Martha sighed, wiping her hands on the apron again before stepping down from the porch and approaching her husband. There was a quiet tenderness in her touch as she laid a hand on his arm, a gentle squeeze, like she wanted to pull him back. Fadu reality. Lewis turned to her with a tired half-smile, but his gaze still looked distant. "You could try getting closer to your son, Lewis," she said, her voice soft but firm. "He needs you." Lewis looked down at the ground, nudging the tip of his boot against the dry earth. He knew Ethan saw him as a stranger, a cold, impenetrable mystery. But how to explain to a teenager that the ghosts of dead men still lived inside him? How to tell him that his nightmares came not from darkness, but from absolute silence, from the sound of his own breathing while he waited in the jungle for an enemy that never announced itself? He wanted to be a better father, who wanted to give his son what he never had. But every time he tried, something inside him froze, as though the war had robbed him of the ability to fully feel. Before he could respond, the rumble of an approaching engine cut through the farm's morning calm. A black pickup rolled down the dirt road, kicking up dust as it neared the house. Lewis's shoulders tensed, his sharp gaze fixed on the vehicle. He'd seen that truck before. When it stopped, the door opened and Ray Danton climbed out with a lazy, contemptuous grin on his face. His dark suit clashed with the Texas heat, but he didn't seem to care, moving with the confidence of a man used to getting whatever he wanted. Behind him, two burly men got out, arms crossed, tattoos visible under sleeves rolled to the elbows. They weren't there to talk. "Morning, McCann," Danton said, shoving his hands in his pockets as he walked toward Lewis. "Nice piece of land you got here." Lewis didn't answer right away. He sized Danton up, taking in every detail, the relaxed stance, a nervous twitch in his right hand, the way his men kept their hands near their waists, where they probably carried guns. He'd seen men like this before, predators, men who took what they wanted without caring about the consequences. But there was a vital difference between ordinary predators and those who truly knew how to hunt. Danton had no idea he was up against a much more experienced wolf. "Get to the point, Danton," Lewis said, crossing his arms. "I'm not one for small talk." The businessman smiled wider, as if he'd been expecting that reaction. He took a step forward and pointed to the surrounding fields. "I made a fair offer, Lewis. This piece of land is in the way of my new development. You and your family could leave here with good money in your pockets, start a new life somewhere else. But it seems you're too attached to a bunch of old earth and wood." Martha clenched her jaw, feeling the tension in the air. She wanted to say something, wanted to drive that man away, but she knew Lewis well enough to realize that, at that moment, any word from her could only make things worse. "I'm not selling," Lewis said, his voice as solid as stone. Danton sighed like he was genuinely disappointed. He glanced at the men beside him and smiled. "Her shame," he murmured, turning his gaze back to Lewis. "Because I'm not used to hearing no." Lewis remained motionless, like he was part of the very ground he stood on. But Martha felt the air around them change. Something deep and dangerous had awakened in her husband, an instinct she hadn't seen since he came back from the war. Danton patted Lewis's shoulder before turning to head back to his truck. "I'll give you a few days to reconsider," he said, over his shoulder, "but I suggest you make the right choice." Lewis watched the truck drive away, his jaw clenched tight. He knew what that meant. It wasn't an offer, it was a warning. When he turned to look at Martha, he saw fear in her eyes, and it was justified. Lewis knew Danton would return, and when he did, he wouldn't just bring words. Night fell over Thunder Creek like a heavy curtain, cloaking the McCann farm in deep silence. The wind howled through the dry trees, carrying with it the smell of warm earth and old straw. Martha ate dinner in silence, her eyes fixed on Lewis's empty chair, while Ethan pushed his food around on his plate, lost in thought. Ever since Danton's visit that morning, tension hung over the house like a storm about to break. The family had faced hard times before, but this threat felt different, more tangible, like the peace they had built over the years was about to be mercilessly crushed. Lewis hadn't come in for dinner. Martha knew he was outside, patrolling the farm, doing what he always did when his mind was unsettled, preparing for the worst. She didn't need to see him to know that he was walking slowly through the fields, watching the property lines with the eyes of a man who never fully trusted peace. It made her feel safe, but also filled her with deep sadness. No matter how many years passed, Lewis would never be just a farmer. He would always carry with him the invisible scars of war. Ethan dropped his utensils onto the table with a dull thud, crossing his arms and glaring at his mother impatiently. "So that's it? We're just going to pretend nothing happened?" His voice held more frustration than fear, the typical tone of a teenager who still believed the world was simple. Martha sighed, wiping her hands on her apron before looking back at him. She understood her son's anger, but she also knew Lewis didn't handle threats in a normal way. He wasn't a man who went straight to the police or asked for help, not out of pride, but because he knew better than anyone that some battles had to be won the right way. "Your father is dealing with it, Ethan," Trust him. The boy let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Dealing with it how? Pretending Danton will just quit? You saw how those men looked at us, Mom. This won't end that easily. Before Martha could respond, a distant sound cut through the night. Engines. The deep, angry rumble of trucks coming down the dirt road. Lewis appeared on the porch before Martha and Ethan could react. He already knew. There was something in the way he moved, quick and silent, like an animal sensing a predator's approach. His gaze swept over the road, catching the headlights growing closer at high speed. Stay inside. Lock the doors. His voice was firm, yet calm, devoid of panic or hesitation. Ethan felt a chill run up his spine. He had never heard his father talk like that before. Martha grabbed her husband's arm, her eyes begging for something even she couldn't define. "Lewis, please." He touched her face gently, but made no promises. He never made promises he couldn't keep. The trucks sped across the field, tires crushing the dry grass under the weight of the engines. Blinding lights invaded the yard, casting menacing shadows against the wooden house. And then they got out. There were at least 8 men, some holding baseball bats, others just watching with mocking smiles. The vultures. Danton wasn't among them, but his message was clear. The group spread out over the property, surrounding the house with the cruel patience of those who know they can take whatever they want. Lewis stepped down the porch steps unhurriedly, boots treading firmly on the dry ground. He showed no fear. His sharp, cold gaze assessed each face, every improvised weapon, every movement, like he could predict the next few minutes before they even happened. One of the men, a big brute with a scar running from his chin to his eyebrow, twirled a baseball bat between his fingers, smiling. "Beautiful night, isn't it, farmer?" His voice dripped with venomous mockery, like it was all a game. Lewis didn't answer, didn't break eye contact. He just waited. Another man, leaner with a cigarette dangling from his lips, kicked a nearby barrel, sending it rolling to Lewis's feet. "The boss wants a message delivered. Looks like you didn't get our offer, so we came to reinforce it." The scarred brute laughed, and suddenly, without warning, raised his bat and brought it down on the fence, splintering the wood with a loud crack. The sound echoed through the night, followed by more laughter. Another man poured gasoline over a pile of hay near the barn. Martha watched everything through the window, breath caught in her throat, fingers gripping the curtain. Ethan stood next to her, fists clenched, heart pounding wildly. "Is Dad going to do something?" he whispered, without taking his eyes off the scene. Martha didn't answer. She knew Lewis too well. She knew he was waiting. The man with the cigarette pulled a lighter from his pocket, flicking the flame into the air. "Last chance, McCann. Either you leave willingly, or by morning this place will be ashes." That's when Lewis finally moved. There was no hesitation, no warning, just a blur of swift, precise movements. Before the cigarette could drop onto the hay, before the brute could swing his bat again, before any of them even realized what was happening, Lewis attacked. The first thing Martha heard was the sickening crack of a bone snapping. The brute fell to his knees with a roar of pain, clutching his wrist that now dangled at a strange angle. The lighter flew from the other man's hand before he even realized Lewis was on him, twisting his arm behind his back and slamming him to the ground with a perfect takedown. A brutal silence followed. The other men, who moments before oozed arrogance, now hesitated, shrinking back. Lewis's glare cut through them like sharp blades. "Go back to Danton." His voice was low, but carried a weight no one there dared challenge. "Tell him that if he sets foot on this land again, I won't be so patient." Fear seized the group. One by one, they scrambled back to their trucks, dragging their injured companions in a rush. No more laughter, no more threats, only the realization that they had made a terrible mistake. Lewis stood in the middle of the yard, watching the headlights disappear down the road. His heart beat steadily, calmly. He didn't need to look back to know Martha and Ethan were watching him. He knew that at this very moment, something had changed forever between them. He wasn't just a farmer. He wasn't an ordinary man. And now, they knew it. Silence lay over the McCann farm like a thick curtain, filling every space with a nearly tangible tension. The smell of spilled gasoline still lingered in the air, mixed with the straw Lewis had managed to keep from igniting before the flames consumed everything. In the yard, footprints and tire tracks in the dirt told the story of what had happened that night. A warning had been given, but Lewis knew better than anyone that men like Ray Danton didn't surrender to a single blow. Inside the house, Martha sat at the kitchen table without speaking. The clock above the sink read nearly 3 in the morning, but she knew she wouldn't sleep. Her fingers clutched the apron in her lap, a subconscious gesture of anxiety. Since she met Lewis, she had learned to accept his silences, the way he avoided certain conversations, and how he always seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. But tonight, there was something different. Ethan sat beside her, arms crossed on the table, his expression full of questions he didn't know how to voice. His father had always been a mystery, a man of few words and even fewer explanations. But after what he witnessed tonight, Ethan felt he knew nothing about Lewis McCann. The back door opened and Lewis came in, his shirt dirty with dust and sweat, eyes hard, carrying an internal storm. The sound of running water echoed in the kitchen, the only noise aside from the slow ticking of the clock. Martha could no longer hold back her words. "That was a mistake, Lewis." He didn't respond right away. He shut off the water. He grabbed a towel to dry his hands, and then turned to face her. His eyes held that look she knew all too well, the same look he'd had when he returned from the war, when he woke up in the night, drenched in sweat, fists clenched, trapped in a place no one could reach. "They were going to burn our house," he said, voice low but firm. "If I had done nothing, what would happen tomorrow or the next day?" Martha ran a hand over her face, exhausted. "You think they'll stop now? You hurt 2 of them, humiliated the others. Danton isn't the kind of man who just accepts being challenged, Lewis. He'll be back. And next time, he won't bring gasoline. He'll bring bullets." Lewis knew she was right. Men like Danton didn't know how to lose, but he also knew that doing nothing wouldn't have stopped what was coming next. If he had yielded, if he had bowed his head, the vultures would return either way, and next time they wouldn't just be trying to scare them. They'd be out to destroy. Ethan watched his father quietly, heart still racing from what he had seen. The man who had faced those invaders without hesitation, who had taken down 2 grown men with his bare hands in seconds, that man was not the one he knew. He took a deep breath and finally asked, "Who are you, Dad?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Lewis met his son's gaze, measuring him, choosing his words carefully. For years, he had avoided this moment, postponing the conversation, pretending he could just be a farmer and erase all those years of blood and war. But tonight, for the first time, he realized it was too late. Ethan had seen it with his own eyes. Lewis pulled out a chair and sat down. His gaze moved across the wood grain of the table before finally resting on his son. "I was a SEAL." Ethan blinked in surprise at the simplicity of the reply. He knew his father had served in the military, but it was the first time he'd heard something concrete. A SEAL. He didn't know much about special forces, but he knew enough to grasp the weight of that word. "What does that mean?" he asked hesitantly. Lewis ran a hand over his face before answering. "It means I spent half my life doing things no one should ever have to do. Missions no one knew existed. Things you weren't allowed to talk about." Martha lowered her head, closing her eyes briefly. She had always known Lewis carried something inside him, something that kept him awake some nights, sitting on the porch until dawn, watching the horizon as if waiting for something that never came. But hearing it out loud, seeing him admit, it made her chest tighten in a way she couldn't describe. Ethan, on the other hand, didn't know how to feel. The father he knew, or thought he knew, was a man of few words, someone who never raised his voice, never showed emotion. But now he understood. Lewis wasn't silent by nature. He was silent because he carried too many secrets. "I never wanted this to come to you," Lewis went on, his voice now softer. "Never wanted my family to know who I was. But the world doesn't always give us a choice." Ethan swallowed hard. So what now? What do we do? Lewis rested his elbows on the table and laced his fingers together. He had already considered the possibilities. They could pack up and disappear, move to another state, leave the farm behind, but running wasn't an option. Danton will come back, he said bluntly, and when he does, he'll come with everything he's got. Martha's heart clenched. Then let's go, Lewis. Let's take our things and leave before he has a chance. This isn't worth our lives. Lewis looked at her with gentle eyes, placing his hand over hers. If we go, he wins. He takes our land, takes everything we've built. And when he finds another farmer in his way, he'll do the same thing. If we let it happen here, it'll never stop. Ethan looked at them both, feeling the weight of that decision. He knew his mother wanted to run, but for the first time, he saw something different in his father's eyes, something unbreakable. Lewis wasn't a man who ran, wasn't a man who bowed down. "I'm not leaving," Ethan said suddenly, his voice carrying a certainty he hadn't realized he possessed. "I'm staying." Martha's eyes widened. "Ethan, no." He turned to Lewis. "Teach me." Lewis studied his son's face for a long moment. He didn't want this for him, he never had. From that moment on, nothing would be the same. The sky was still dark when Lewis got out of bed, feeling the familiar pang of accumulated aches over the years. His body was a map of invisible scars, reminders of missions and battles that had shaped every muscle, every instinct that was now waking up again. He looked at Martha, asleep by his side, her face peaceful despite the tension of recent days. He knew that once she woke up, she would offer that same silent plea, that worried look, that attempt to make him reconsider. But Lewis had already made his decision. He dressed quietly, pulling on a flannel shirt and the well-worn boots. That had accompanied him on the farm for years. Stepping outside, the chill of dawn cut through his skin, and he took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. The smell of damp earth and the barn's old wood still carried the faint trace of gasoline from the previous night, blended with the bittersweet memory of something he hadn't felt in a long time: anticipation. Ethan was already in the yard, standing with arms folded, eyes fixed on his father with a mix of hesitation and determination. There was something different about his stance, a sudden maturity forced by circumstances. Lewis watched him for a moment, studying him the way he would evaluate a new recruit, looking for signs of fear or doubt. But what he saw was a steady gaze. A boy who, though he might not fully understand what he was asking for, was willing to learn. "Let's start with the basics," Lewis said, walking to the old shed beside the barn. Ethan followed without hesitation. Inside, the shed smelled of dust and rust, and the faint morning light barely illuminated the outlines of tools hanging on the walls. Toward the back, under a sheet stained by time, was a metal case. Lewis knelt in front of it, his fingers tracing the cold surface before finally unlocking the side latches. When he opened it, the smell of gun oil and old fabric filled the air. Ethan watched as his father carefully removed each item stored there. First, a military-grade pocket knife with a titanium handle and a blade sharp as a razor. Then a broken watch, which Lewis held for a moment before setting it aside, as though just seeing it brought back some invisible weight. But it was. The next item that made Ethan hold his breath. A Sig Sauer P226 pistol, immaculate, the black metal gleaming in the dim light. Lewis held it with a natural familiarity, as if it was part of him, as though his hand had been made for it. Ethan had never seen his father with a gun. Throughout his life, Lewis had avoided talking about violence and about what he'd done in the service, but now it was all right here in front of him, undisguised. Lewis finally broke the silence. "This gun saved my life more times than I can count," he said, eyes never leaving the pistol, "but it also took things from me I'll never get back." Ethan didn't know how to respond. He understood he wasn't just learning to defend himself. He was entering a world from which he might never return. Lewis picked up a cartridge of bullets and began loading the weapon with precise, mechanical movements. The metallic sound of the magazine sliding into place echoed in the shed. Then he raised his eyes to his son. "You still want to learn?" Ethan took a deep breath. He did, not because he liked the idea of holding a gun, but because he now understood the world was a dangerous place, and relying on others to protect him was no longer an option. He nodded. Lewis said nothing more. He simply handed the pistol to him. The weight of the gun was heavier than Ethan had expected. The cold metal against his skin sent a shiver through him, not of fear, but of respect. He had never held a weapon before, and for a moment, its weight seemed to carry something far greater than just its material. It carried responsibility. It carried death. "Never put your finger on the trigger until you're sure of what you're doing," Lewis said, voice calm but firm. "A gun isn't a toy. It's not a symbol of power. It's a tool. And like any tool, used the wrong way, it destroys more than it builds." Ethan nodded, trying to absorb every word. Then Lewis guided him outside the shed, leading him to a tree at the far end of the pasture, where he'd hung some empty cans for makeshift targets. "Feet apart. Keep your balance. Take a deep breath before you shoot." Ethan obeyed, tried adjusting his stance. His heart hammered against his chest and his hands were sweating. He raised the gun, aligned the sights on the nearest can, and pulled the trigger. The shot reverberated through the morning air, and the strong smell of gunpowder filled the space between them. Ethan missed. The recoil shook his arm more than expected, and the bullet vanished into nothing. He only walked over, adjusted his grip, and made sure he was holding the gun correctly. "Try again." Ethan took a deep breath, steadied his feet, and aimed once more. The second shot made the can wobble. The third knocked it off the fence. Lowering the gun, he felt the weight of the moment. It wasn't a feeling of triumph, it was understanding. He was no longer the same boy he was yesterday. Something inside him had changed. Lewis gave him a small nod of approval, saying that it was just the beginning. Ethan looked at his father and realized, perhaps for the first time, that Lewis wasn't just teaching him how to shoot. He was teaching him how to survive. But neither of them knew that while they trained, eyes were watching them from the road, hidden by distance and the shadows of the trees. The war that approached wouldn't wait until they were ready. The sun slowly rose over Thunder Creek, painting the sky orange as the heat started to spread across the dry land. Lewis and Ethan stood in the open field, their bodies covered in sweat, lungs burning from the intensity of the training. Morning had barely begun, but it already felt like they had lived a whole day. Ethan had never been so exhausted, but inside, something had changed. A quiet determination, a desire to prove to himself that he wasn't just a frightened boy holding a gun. Lewis moved with precision, feet firmly on the ground, posture upright as if every motion had been repeated thousands of times. His cold, vigilant gaze took in each mistake Ethan made, every hesitation in the trigger finger, every time his breath caught at the critical moment. He didn't shout or push him with harsh words, but his mere presence was enough to make Ethan feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "Again," Lewis said, handing him an old Winchester rifle, the same one his father had given him when he was Ethan's age. "Aim, control your breathing, and squeeze the trigger between heartbeats." Ethan adjusted his stance, spreading his feet as his father had taught him, focusing. The rifle's wooden stock felt hot in his hands, and he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He wanted to hit the target, needed to. When he finally pulled the trigger, the shot echoed across the field, and the can rattled on the fence but didn't fall. Lewis nodded, not showing frustration. "Better, but don't let anxiety take over. The target isn't going anywhere. Your biggest enemy, Ethan, is yourself." Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, took a deep breath. Phaon tried again. The second shot was more accurate. The third was even better. Lewis observed in silence, watching his son's progress with a mix of pride and concern. He didn't want Ethan learning to kill, but he wanted him to be able to protect himself. After hours of practice, Lewis finally lowered his own gun and walked into the shed, leaving Ethan to catch his breath. The boy stood there, feeling the rifle's weight still in his hands, staring at the bullet holes in the fence, and realizing that little by little he was changing. He wasn't sure if it was good or bad. When he entered the shed, he found Lewis opening a metal trunk, eyes fixed on its contents as if seeing a piece of himself. Inside, Besides the weapons Ethan already knew about, there was something else. A set of tactical knives, razor-sharp blades glinting under the dim light. Lewis picked one up, twirling it in his fingers with the skill of someone who'd done it thousands of times. Hand-to-hand combat is never the first option, he said, never taking his eyes off the knife. But if it comes to that, you either end the fight quickly or you don't walk away. Ethan swallowed hard, noting the calmness with which his father talked about it. He'd always known Lewis was different from other dads, but in that moment, it felt like he was looking at a complete stranger. This wasn't just a farmer teaching his son how to shoot. It was a soldier preparing him for war. Lewis picked up one of the smaller knives and handed it to Ethan, watching his reaction closely. The boy held the blade carefully, feeling its weight, trying to grip it as though it came naturally. Lewis noticed immediately how fast he was learning. "Your body has to move before your mind," Lewis said, raising his own knife and making a quick slash in the air, as if striking an invisible enemy. "When the fight starts, you don't have time to think. Your muscles need to respond. Before your brain even processes what's happening." Ethan tried to mimic his father's movement, but was clumsy, uncoordinated. Lewis gave a faint smile, the first that day, and adjusted Ethan's posture with steady hands. Again, so faster. Training continued into the afternoon, with Lewis teaching Ethan how to move, dodge, and strike. Each error was corrected patiently, every move perfected until the boy began to feel comfortable with the blade in his hands. When they finally stopped to rest, Ethan was physically exhausted, but his mind was more alert than ever. He looked at his father, who took a swig of water, eyes lost in distant thoughts. Part of Ethan wanted to ask more about Lewis's past, about the missions he never mentioned, the battles that left those invisible scars in his gaze, but at the same time, he was afraid of the answers. Silence between them was broken by the sound of a car approaching. Martha stood on the porch, frowning as she saw a police truck driving onto the property. Sheriff Tom Riggins stepped out, adjusting his belt and walking slowly toward Lewis. "McCann," the sheriff said, his eyes drifting over the makeshift targets, the knives on the table, the rifle still slung over Ethan's shoulder. "Looks like you've been getting ready for something." Lewis crossed his arms, not answering right away. He knew Riggins wasn't there just to talk. The sheriff sighed, scratching the back of his neck, as if already tired of the conversation. "Ray Danton was at my office this morning," he went on. "He wants to press charges. Says you attacked his men without provocation." Martha hurried down the porch steps, her face a mix of disbelief and anger. "That's nonsense. They came here last night to threaten our family. They poured gasoline near the barn, tried to drive us off our own land." Riggins raised a hand, asking for calm. "I know, but you know how things work in this town, Martha. Danton's got influence. He's spreading his version of the story, saying he was the victim of an ambush." Lewis remained silent for a moment, watching the sheriff with a hard stare. He knew men like Riggins. The sheriff wasn't completely corrupt, but neither was he the type to risk himself for others. He wasn't there to help. He was there to warn. "What do you want from me, Tom?" Lewis finally asked. The sheriff sighed, looking uncomfortable. "I want you to avoid escalating this. Danton will want revenge. If that happens, I can't stop the town from turning into a war zone." Lewis set his jaw. "If he comes after my family again, Tom, it won't be a war zone. It'll be a massacre." The sheriff locked eyes with Lewis for a moment before looking away and shaking his head. "Just be careful, Lewis. This isn't over yet." He turned and walked back to his truck, leaving behind a sense of inevitability in the air. As the vehicle disappeared into the distance, Ethan looked at his father, expression loaded with questions. Lewis picked up a knife from the table, twirling it in his fingers thoughtfully. "We have less time than I thought," he muttered. Martha crossed her arms, worry etched into her face. "What does that mean?" Lewis looked at her, then at Ethan. "It means Danton won't wait long to make his next move, and when he comes, we can't be caught off guard." Ethan felt a chill run through him. War was closer than ever. Night fell over thunder, creek with a different weight, carrying a silence that didn't fit the usual peace of the McCann farm. The air was heavy with expectation, as if the land, the trees, and even the animals knew something was about to happen. Martha cooked dinner in silence, moving mechanically around the kitchen, her gaze lost in thoughts she didn't dare speak aloud. The smell of roasted meat mixed with the aroma of fresh corn and homemade bread, creating a bittersweet sense of normalcy in the face of imminent chaos. In the dining room, Lewis sat at the table sharpening one of the knives he kept in the shed, the sound of blade sliding against whetstone echoing softly. Ethan watched his every move, trying to absorb the meticulous patience with which his father prepared his tools, as though each action carried some hidden meaning. The boy still felt the ache in his arms from holding the rifle all day, muscles sore from the intense training. But more than that, he felt a change within himself. Tonight, for the first time, he realized that tomorrow he wouldn't be the same. Martha finally turned, looking at them with a mixture of love and exasperation. There was something deeply wrong with that scene. A father sharpening knives like he was preparing for battle, a son watching him intently, eager to learn whatever was needed to survive. This wasn't normal. It wasn't the life she wanted for her family. "This is wrong, Lewis." Her voice shattered the silence almost abruptly. Lewis lifted his eyes to her, pausing the blade's movement for a moment but not replying. "What are we doing?" she continued, voice tight. "We're sitting down to dinner like this is just another evening, but we know it's not. We know those men will be back. We know," her voice broke, "that our lives will never be the same." Lewis closed his eyes briefly before setting the knife on the table and clasping his fingers together. He wanted to say something comforting, something to lighten her burden, but there were no words to soften the inevitable. "I know you want me to say it's all going to be okay," he finally said, "but I can't promise that." Martha sat at the table, resting her elbows on the old worn wood. She looked at Ethan, who kept his head down, avoiding her gaze. Her son was changing before her eyes, and she didn't know if she could bring him back. "You're pulling Ethan into this, Lewis. You're teaching our son to fight like he's a soldier, but he's not. He's just a boy." Ethan felt guilt tighten in his chest. He wanted to tell her he wasn't just a boy anymore, that he understood what was happening, and that there was no running from reality. Yet he knew that to her, he would always be her child, and nothing more. Lewis took a deep breath, placing his hands on the table. "I didn't want this for him, Martha, but I'd rather teach our son to defend himself than bury him because he wasn't ready for what's coming." The silence that followed was painful. Martha squeezed her eyes shut, as if trying to contain the tears, but a single drop escaped down her cheek. Ethan finally raised his gaze, heart pounding with guilt. "Mom, I have to learn." Martha looked at her son for a long moment, trying to see in him the boy she had raised, the one who spent afternoons fishing at the lake and who, until recently, dreamed of leaving town to go study. But now here he was at the kitchen table, a young man who had crossed a line from which he could never return. She nodded slowly, wiping the tear away with the back of her hand. "Then promise me, both of you, promise me this will end, that after this fight, we'll move on, that we won't spend the rest of our lives waiting for the next enemy." Lewis took her hand firmly. "I promise." Ethan placed his hand on hers, squeezing gently. "I promised too." For a moment, they were just a family. The sound of the wind outside, the smell of hot food, the warmth of their hands joined together. But war was already lurking. When the meal ended, Lewis stood up and went to a small cupboard in the corner of the kitchen. Ethan watched as his father took something from the drawer and returned to the table, placing the object in front of him. It was an old military watch, its glass cracked and the wear of time etched into its steel. "It belonged to my best friend," Lewis said, gazing at the watch with distant eyes. "We lost him on a mission when we were your age, Ethan. Since then, I've carried this, a reminder that some battles don't end the way we expect." Ethan swallowed hard as he picked up the watch, handling it carefully. Its weight seemed to carry stories that would never fully be told. Lewis stood and walked to the door, staring out into the darkness for a long moment. He sensed it. They were coming. "Ethan," he called, without taking his eyes off. "The road." The boy immediately rose, heart pounding. "Time to make the rounds." He glanced at his mother, who only sighed and nodded. She didn't agree, but she had accepted that she couldn't stop what was coming. Lewis grabbed the rifle resting by the door and slung it over his shoulder, stepping off the porch with Ethan right behind him. The air had turned colder, carrying the distant scent of damp earth. The silence felt different. Ethan looked at his father, a sudden tension gripping him. "You think they'll come tonight?" Lewis narrowed his eyes, scanning the road with the precision of someone who had spent years spotting threats in hostile terrain. He saw nothing, but he felt it. "They're already close." Ethan clutched the rifle tighter, adrenaline surging through his veins. This was real. Lewis took a deep breath, feeling a familiar old instinct kick in. This was the moment he feared most and yet had spent his life preparing for. He turned to his son, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens, stay calm. Breathe. Think before you act." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. The night seemed to close in on them, carrying the promise of something inevitable. Inside the house, Martha stood by the window, hands pressed to her chest. She knew that by morning something would change forever, and that when the sun came up, not all of them would remain unscathed. Darkness spread over Thunder Creek like a dense cloak, enveloping the McCann farm in heavy silence. The wind whispered through the dry trees. Next to him, Ethan gripped the rifle tightly, breathing in controlled rhythm but heart-pounding. He felt the adrenaline rushing through his body, mingling with the anxiety of the unknown. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know when. Time seemed to drag. Every sound, rustling leaves, the squeak of old porchboards underfoot, the distant moo of cattle, felt amplified, as if the very surroundings were warning them of what was about to happen. Lewis remained still, listening, feeling the wind on his skin, searching for any anomaly in the night's natural rhythm. Then he noticed silence had grown too deep. No more insects, no crickets, no frogs by the nearby creek. What had once been nature's lullaby had turned into an oppressive void. Lewis knew at that moment they were there. "Ethan, move to the side of the barn. Stay in the shadows. Don't move until I tell you." His voice was quiet and controlled, counting, showing no fear or hesitation. Ethan, without question, did as ordered, moving carefully, trying to mimic Lewis's light footfalls. His heart pounded, but he remembered to control his breathing just as his father had taught. Every move had to be deliberate, every step measured. Lewis stepped off the porch and walked slowly toward the center of the yard, eyes adjusting to the darkness. He couldn't see them yet, but he knew they were out there. Then, as if the entire night held its breath, the first sound sliced through the silence. The roar of engines filled the air, echoing like thunder from the shadows. The vultures were here. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine as he spotted the distant headlights on the road. 1, 2, 3 trucks, barreling in fast, raising dust on the dry path. He clutched the rifle, drawing a deep breath. This was real. This was happening. Lewis didn't move. He stayed right where he was, waiting, watching. The vehicles drew closer, slowing as they reached the entrance to the property. The doors opened almost in unison, and men poured out of the trucks like predators scenting blood. Ray Danton was the last to emerge. Unlike last time, he wasn't smiling. Wearing a dark overcoat, gloved hands gripping a half-burned cigar, he walked toward Lewis with the steady calm of someone who knew exactly why he was there. The other men spread out, forming a threatening semicircle. Altogether, there were 9, more than Lewis expected. "It's over. McCann, you can't win this time." Lewis took a step forward, not breaking eye contact. "I've already won, Danton. You just haven't realized it yet." It all happened at once then. Before anyone could react, the farm's lights went out abruptly, plunging everything into darkness. The vultures spun around in confusion, trying to figure out what was happening. That was when Lewis attacked. The first blow fell before anyone had the chance to draw a weapon. In a single fluid motion, Lewis caught the nearest attacker off guard, dispatching him with a swift, precise strike. The man collapsed before he even realized what had hit him. Ethan, in position behind a bale of hay, followed his father's instructions. He wasn't supposed to shoot until the last possible moment, but when he saw one of the men point a handgun toward the barn, Ethan knew he had to act. His shot pierced the night, and the attacker dropped to the ground, clutching a bleeding shoulder. Not dead, but out of the fight. Ethan felt the adrenaline surge like electricity through his body, but he had no time to think. He quickly reloaded, exactly the way his father had shown him. The vultures tried to fight back, but they were the ones being hunted. Lewis moved among them like a storm, striking with surgical precision. A throat strike here, a kick too, the ribs there. He didn't need bullets to win. Seeing his men fall one by one, Danton backed up toward his truck. Fear was etched on his face. "Lewis, wait, we can talk." Lewis walked slowly toward him, wiping blood from his hands. With a rag. His expression was blank, eyes like a man who'd already made up his mind. "You had your chance." Danton tried to run, but Lewis was faster. With a swift move, he twisted his arm, slamming him against the truck's hood. Danton screamed, feeling the pressure on his shoulder. "Please, Lewis, I'll do whatever you want. I'll leave town. I won't come back." Lewis leaned in close enough to whisper in his ear, "You should have left when you had the chance." Then, in one final blow, he smashed Danton's nose against the metal. The man slumped to the ground, moaning, clutching his bloody face. The fight was over. The few surviving vultures fled, dragging along anyone who could still stand. They had learned their lesson the hard way. Lewis stood in the center of the yard, the dust settling around him. His heartbeat was steady, calm. He turned toward the barn, spotting Ethan emerging from the shadows, still trembling from the rush of the fight. "Dad, is this it? Is it over?" Ethan asked, voice trembling slightly. Lewis nodded, meeting his son's eyes. "4. So then Bochid, yes. Now they know who they're dealing with." The night turned quiet once more, but this time it wasn't fear filling the air. It was respect. By the time dawn lightened the horizon, Lewis finally let go of the rifle and leaned against a tree near the barn. The scent of gunpowder still hung in the air, mingling with sweat and the dried blood from some of the attackers who lay unconscious around the farm. He had won this battle, but he knew the war was far from over. Ethan stood nearby, face pale in the bluish morning light, eyes still reflecting the shock of what had happened. His hands shook, even though he tried to hide it. He wasn't the same boy he was yesterday. Martha came down the porch steps, tension in her every step as she surveyed her husband and son. She didn't ask how many were injured or if Danton was still a threat. She already knew the answers. She walked over to Ethan and gently cupped his face, studying his eyes, looking for any trace of the boy she had raised. But all she saw was a young man who had learned to see the world through war-tinted eyes. "Go rest a bit, my love," she said softly, though her voice was firm with concern. Ethan hesitated, but he needed the rest. His body felt drained, muscles aching from the tension of holding the rifle. He cast a final glance at his father before heading into the house. He knew Lewis wouldn't sleep. Lewis stayed right, where he was watching the horizon. The fields looked as they always did, wheat swaying in the breeze, the pasture standing firm, and birds resuming their morning songs. But he knew nothing would ever be the same. Martha came closer. Arms crossed, a swirl of emotions reflected on her face. She didn't want to argue, didn't want to repeat everything she'd said the night before. But there was one truth she couldn't deny. "You turned him into one of you, Lewis." Lewis didn't take his eyes off the field. He took a deep breath before replying. "I taught him to survive." She ran her hands over her face, in frustration. "Surviving doesn't mean carrying a rifle and shooting grown men in the middle of the night. He's just a boy." Lewis finally turned to her, and Martha felt a shiver. His eyes were different. There was no anger. But there was no room for doubt or remorse either. There was only that absolute certainty, cold as steel. "And if I hadn't taught him?" Martha opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because she knew deep down Lewis was right. If Ethan hadn't learned, if he had hesitated at the wrong moment, he might be hurt, or worse. Lewis lowered his head briefly before speaking again. "I wanted something else for him, Martha, but the world didn't ask what I wanted." She felt her eyes sting with tears, but she held them back. No more room for weakness. She reached for his hand and squeezed it. What do we do now? Lewis laced his fingers in hers for a moment, feeling her warmth, then sighed heavily. Now we finish what started. The hours slipped by without rest. Lewis gathered everything that might be useful. Weapons, supplies, reinforcing. The house and barn. Every detail had to be ready. Danton would come back, and he would come back swinging. In the early afternoon, as he was repairing the fences, he heard an engine approaching. Instantly, he picked up his shotgun and walked to the road, ready for anything. But when the car came into view, he saw it wasn't the Vultures. It was Sheriff Tom Riggins. He stopped his vehicle and got out slowly, looking worn out. He held a crumpled envelope in his hand and extended it to Lewis, face heavy with regret. Danton filed an official claim to seize your land. He says your family is a danger to the town, that you threatened and attacked innocent citizens. He's got people at the courthouse who'll listen to him. Martha stood on the porch, apron still dusted with flour from lunch, listening with disbelief. That's ridiculous, she exclaimed. He tried to burn down our barn, tried to force us off our land. The sheriff lifted a hand for calm. I know, but you know how things work in this town, Martha. Danton's got pull. He's already spinning this to his advantage, saying he was the victim of a cowardly ambush. Lewis took the envelope, not looking at it. His gaze locked on the sheriff. And you're here warning me because, Tom sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Because I know it's a setup. But I also know you're not going to. Danton is going to want payback. And if that happens, I can't stop this town from becoming a war zone. Lewis narrowed his eyes. If he comes after my family again, Tom, it won't be a war zone. It'll be a massacre. They locked eyes momentarily, before the sheriff looked away, shaking his head. Just be careful, McCann. This has already gone too far. He climbed back into the truck and left. Lewis stood there, the envelope in his pocket feeling heavier than it should have. He knew. The war had gone too far, but it would only end when one side fell. And Lewis refused to be the first to fall. Night fell over Thunder Creek like a dark veil, turning the McCann farm into a silent battlefield. The smell of gunpowder and rust lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of dry earth and burnt wood. Each detail seemed to hold its breath, as though nature itself braced for something terrible about to happen. Lewis stood on the porch motionless, eyes locked on the dirt road leading to the farm. He felt the rough wood beneath his palms and the light nighttime breeze on his face. But his mind was elsewhere. He had lived this scene before, waiting for confrontation, anticipating danger, knowing that once the dust settled, not everyone would still be standing. That was the cost of war, and he knew it all too well. Inside, Martha finished dinner, the smell of roasted meat wafting through the house, mixing with the tension that had built up all day. She knew that tonight might be the last they had together, knew that Lewis and Ethan might never again step through the kitchen door as a complete family, but she also knew there was no going back. This battle had to be fought. The fear in her chest was overwhelming, but there was something deeper than that. Acceptance. Ethan was in the barn, checking the supplies under his father's guidance. His rifle rested against a bale of hay, his fingers sweaty from the nerves he tried to control. All this still felt like an unreal dream, something that shouldn't be happening to him. Yet he knew he belonged in that moment. Lewis, beside him, calmly inspected the weapons, rechecking ammunition. Every movement was firm and precise, as if it were just another chore, but they both knew it wasn't. This was no ordinary night. They're going to come heavy this time, aren't they? Ethan asked, voice steady but filled with a seriousness he hadn't known he had. Lewis didn't answer right away. He kept examining a pistol, then finally looked at Ethan. Yes, but they won't be ready for what we have here. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding what that meant. Danton wouldn't be content with a quick scare. This was war, and both sides knew it. There would be no turning back. The distant growl of engines broke the farm's silence. They were coming. Lewis rose fluidly, rifle cradled. His expression was neutral, as if he were heading out to do routine chores. But Ethan knew better. He could sense the tension, in the air feel the adrenaline buzzing. Martha appeared on the porch, arms crossed, lips trembling. She looked at Lewis with that unspoken plea in her eyes. He gazed back at her for a brief moment, then put on his hat and left, Ethan right behind him. The roar of truck engines grew louder. Headlights pierced the darkness like fierce eyes. This time they weren't here to negotiate. Ray Danton climbed out last, expression brimming with contained fury. He had lost control and knew it. But he still believed he could fix things, with brute force, with violence, with fear. Behind him, 9 men emerged, each holding something. Guns, baseball bats, chains. They had the advantage in numbers. Lewis didn't flinch. "It's over, McCann. You can't win this time." Lewis took a step forward, gaze fixed on Danton. "I've already won, Danton. You just don't know it yet." It all exploded at once. Lights across the farm suddenly went out, plunging everything into near-total darkness. The vultures glanced around, disoriented, and Lewis attacked. Before any of them could react, the first strike came. Lewis's movements were swift, lethal. The nearest attacker crumpled to the ground before he realized he was under attack. Ethan, staying behind a hay barrel, waited for the right moment. When he saw one of them raise a gun toward the house, he fired. The shot lit the darkness for an instant, and the attacker spun, dropping his weapon and clutching a wounded leg. Ethan's heart raced, but he remembered his father's training. Calm, breathe, reload. He did. The vultures panicked. They tried to regroup, but Lewis moved among them like a ghost. He struck with merciless precision, a blow to the neck here, a disarm there. Within moments, their advantage in numbers dissolved into chaos. "This isn't over, McCann," he roared, jumping behind the wheel and flooring the accelerator. The others, seeing their boss flee, scrambled in confusion, some limping to their vehicles, others barely able to stand. But the outcome was decided. The McCann farm was still Lewis's. Ethan came out of the barn, hands still shaking, rifle in hand. Lewis turned to him, breathing steadily, adrenaline still coursing through him. "You did good, son." Ethan swallowed, hard trying to process it all. Will they come back? Lewis inhaled deeply, looking at the empty road. Yeah, but now they know who they're dealing with. Silence returned to the farm. This time, though, it wasn't fearful. It was full of respect. By the time the night deepened, Thunder Creek was blanketed in a silence that felt unnatural. The dust still hung in the air, tinged with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. The yard bore footprints, dark stains where men had fallen, and the echo of retreating engine noise still haunted Lewis's mind. He had won, but unlike other times, he felt no relief. Danton's body lay on the ground, breathing weakly, her face smeared with blood, nose broken at a grotesque angle. He wouldn't be getting up as the same man. Lewis knew that if he had any sense, he would never again try to seize Thunder Creek. But the day's violence wouldn't just vanish. There was a price for every battle, and this time the cost was within his own home. Ethan stood by the barn, rifle still slung over his shoulder, gaze distant. His fingers trembled slightly, the adrenaline ebbing. He'd never thought, himself capable of pulling a trigger against another human being. He'd never thought that once done, he couldn't take it back. Lewis knew that feeling. He'd carried it for years. Martha stood at the kitchen door, arms folded, face set in grim acceptance. She knew that, at least for now, the worst was over. But she also knew none of them would ever be the same. Ethan walked into the house, shoulders heavy, not meeting his mother's eyes. He went straight upstairs to his room. Martha watched him go, pressing her lips tightly together. Lewis surveyed the yard a final time. He spotted the broken weapons, the scattered tools, the faint glow of headlights fading in the distance. The farm was safe, yet the tranquility he had protected had been shattered. He finally went inside, finding Martha sitting at the kitchen table, fingers tightly clasped. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. The tension, fear, and relief mingled in her expression. After a moment, she looked up at him. "So it's over." Lewis nodded, taking a seat across from her. He couldn't bring himself to say it out loud, because he wasn't entirely sure. Her eyes roamed over him, noticing the grime, the dried blood. She reached out and touched his arm gently. "You could have died out there, Lewis." He exhaled slowly, the weight of it all pressing on him. If I hadn't fought, we'd have lost everything. Maybe our lives. She stood, walked, over Tews and wrapped her arms around his shoulders, resting her cheek against his hair. They stayed like that for a moment, neither speaking. They both knew the fight had changed them. "It's not just about us, Lewis," she whispered. "Ethan, he's not the same boy. He pulled the trigger." Lewis nodded grimly. "I know." Silence enveloped them. Outside, the farm was quiet, but the memories of the night's battle kept hammering at their minds. Finally, Martha stepped back, rubbing her arms as if trying to ward off a chill. "Can we move on from this?" Lewis raised his eyes to her. "We have to." She looked away, blinking back tears. She wanted to believe they could be a family again, that tomorrow they would wake up and everything would be normal, but deep down she knew the truth. "Then let's start by cleaning this place up." Lewis stood, giving her a slight nod. Perhaps that was the first step, clearing away the debris, one shattered piece at a time. They'd pay the price of victory, but at least they were still standing. Morning arrived, painting the sky a pale blue and lighting up the McCann farm with a piece that didn't match the previous night. A breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of damp earth. Yet beneath this calm, an invisible weight pressed down on everything. Lewis left early, like always, but his stride was slower, as if every step carried the burden of recent decisions. He walked over to the fence and rested against it, surveying the same fields he'd worked his whole life. This land was more than just. His face showed the exhaustion of the previous nights, but there was also something deeper, a new layer of understanding about the world and his place in it. He no longer looked just like a teen upset at his father's silence. He stood, like someone who understood what it meant to fight. "What happens now?" Ethan asked, folding his arms, eyes on the horizon. Lewis didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know, but because he knew the truth wasn't simple. What happened last night didn't end with Danton's fleeing. Violence never truly goes away. It just changes shape. Now we see who makes the next move. Ethan frowned, sliding his hands into his pockets. He didn't like that answer, but he knew it was all his father could give. Lewis wasn't naive enough to think the town would leave them alone after this. Thunder Creek had rules, and the McCanns had just broken them. Before Ethan could speak, an engine approached, a police car. Lewis turned slowly, eyes narrowing as Sheriff Tom Riggins parked in front of the house. The door opened, and Riggins stepped out, looking burdened, like he already knew how the conversation would go. He held an envelope in his hand. "I need to talk to you, Lewis." Martha appeared at the door, still wearing her flour-dusted apron, eyes full of worry. Lewis exchanged a glance with her before walking toward the sheriff. "Speak." Riggins sighed, taking off his hat to run a hand through his gray hair. "Danton went to the county judge this morning, says you and your son tried to kill him, that it was a premeditated attack." Martha's eyes widened in shock. "That's absurd. They came here last night, threatened us, poured gasoline near the barn." Riggins raised a hand. "I know, but Danton doesn't care about the truth. He wants revenge, and he's got enough money to make it look like he's in the right." Lewis stood silent for a moment. He wasn't surprised, just disappointed. "What does that mean?" The sheriff hesitated, hating what he had to say. "It means there's a warrant out for your arrest." Martha pressed a hand to her mouth in disbelief. Ethan felt a chill run through him. After everything they'd done to protect their land, the state wanted to lock them up. Lewis showed no reaction. He just nodded, as though he'd seen it coming. "And what are you going to do, Tom? Take me in?" Riggins hesitated. He knew what Lewis was, knew he wasn't just a farmer. "If this were any other case, I'd have to take you in right now, but I'm not stupid, Lewis. If you'd really wanted Danton dead, he wouldn't have left your property breathing." Lewis clenched his jaw. "So?" The sheriff exhaled slowly. "You've got 24 hours to fix this. After that, I can't hold things off my way any." Town soon came into view, small and ordinary under the rising sun. Thunder Creek looked the same, shops open, people walking along the sidewalks. the smell of coffee from Ruby's diner filling the air. But something was different. The way people turned their heads to watch Lewis's truck. No longer scornful looks. Now there was fear. They knew what had happened the previous night. They knew it wasn't over. Lewis parked in front of Danton's law office, a small brick building with a gold plate near the entrance. He climbed out of the truck slowly, feeling the stares of the townspeople. They wanted to see what would happen next. Ethan followed, trying to steady the tension coiled inside him. His footsteps no longer sounded like a teenager's. They were heavier, like someone who understood that after today, life would never be the same. The office door was ajar. Lewis pushed it open, the chime overhead sounding unnaturally loud. The interior was dimly lit, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and musty paper. Danton was there, waiting. He sat behind a mahogany desk, glass of whiskey in hand, eyes hidden in the shadows cast by drawn curtains. There was no longer any trace of arrogance on his face, only weariness. "So you came." Lewis shut the door behind him, crossing his arms. "You gave me 24 hours, Danton. I'm here to finish this." Danton took a swig of his whiskey, letting the glass clink against the desk. Something was different about him. He no longer looked like the untouchable man who exuded power. Now he looked like a man who knew he had lost. "I never wanted it to come to this, Lewis," Danton said, voice rough and tired. But there were no more lies. Lewis said nothing. He waited. Danton sighed, leaning back in his chair, drumming his fingers against the glass in his hand. "You know my biggest mistake, underestimating you. I thought you were just a stubborn farmer, some relic hanging onto old land." Lewis took a step forward, gaze steady. "And now you understand." Danton gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "Now I understand some men can't be bought, and that I messed with the wrong one." Silence filled the room thick as smoke. There was understanding here. Danton glanced at Lewis, then at Ethan, who stood ready, hand near his waist, where he concealed his pistol. The boy was changed too, and for a moment Danton seemed genuinely afraid. "Do you want to kill me, Lewis?" Lewis's eyes hardened. "If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't have walked out of my farm." Danton nodded slowly. He knew that was true. Lewis leaned over the desk, voice low, waited. "You're leaving town, Danton. Take what's left of your dirty money and never look back. Leave this land alone, because if I hear your name again, if I find out you're still around, the next time there won't be any conversation." Danton swallowed hard. He believed every word. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue. But then his gaze swept around, the shadows cast by his crumbling empire, the files scattered on the desk, the dried blood on his shirt from the previous night. He was no king anymore. He was a defeated man. Without another word, he stood slowly, grabbed his coat and shrugged it on. He picked up a folder of documents and cast one last look around the office before walking toward Lewis. His eyes were different. No challenge. Only acceptance. "Thunder Creek isn't worth my life." Lewis just watched as Danton passed him and walked out. As he left, the townspeople stared. They knew. Lewis took a deep breath, looking at Ethan. The boy was still tense, gripping his gun. He hadn't yet learned how to let his guard down. "It's over, son." Ethan blinked a few times before letting out a shaky sigh and relaxing his shoulders. He wanted to believe it, but he knew that even if this war was over, others would come. They stepped outside, feeling the weight of the town's gaze. They had changed Thunder Creek. Now the question was how the town would respond. Lewis placed a hand on his son's shoulder as they walked back to the pickup. It was time to go home. Time to figure out what it meant to live after the battle. The drive back to the farm was quiet. The rumble of the truck filled the silence, but inside, neither of them spoke. There was no need. Lewis kept his eyes on the dirt road, driving calmly, as if trying to stretch the time between the war's end and the return to normal life. Ethan, beside him, held the rifle, fingers drumming the worn stock. He stared out the window, focusing on the open fields rolling toward the horizon. Danton was gone. The threat was removed. So why did that feeling of unease still crawl under Ethan's skin? He had expected to feel relief the moment he saw the enemy defeated, expected a wave of peace to wash over him once this ordeal was done. But the truth was, battles don't erase the scars they leave behind. The silence now felt heavy, as though every memory of the past few days hovered in the air. Lewis could sense his son's inner turmoil without looking at him. He knew it too well. The first time he killed a man in combat, he felt the same emptiness, the same absence of any triumphant emotion. No one ever talks about the quiet after the fight. They only talk about the adrenaline, about victory. But the silence that follows is its own kind of burden. By the time they pulled up to the house, Martha was on the porch, arms folded, eyes full of worry and hope. She didn't ask what happened at Danton's office. She already knew by the look on Lewis's face. She just took a breath and nodded, touching her husband's arm gently as he passed. Ethan, however, trudged inside, heading straight to his room without a word. Martha watched him, chewing her lip, then looked to Lewis. He's changed. Lewis let out a long sigh. He needs time. She pressed her lips together, eyes brimming with concern. What if he never goes back to how he was? Lewis paused, feeling the weight of her question. Then we help him figure out who he is now. Martha closed her eyes, tears glistening, but she held it together. There was no turning back anyway. Lewis spent the rest of the day mending the barn and tidying up stray debris, while Martha busied herself inside. Ethan never came out of his room. By late afternoon, Lewis climbed the stairs and knocked on the door. "May I come in?" Silence lasted a few seconds before Ethan answered, "Yeah." Lewis opened the door quietly. Ethan was on the edge of his bed, fiddling with the old military watch Lewis had given him, rolling it over and over in his hands as if searching for answers in its cracked face. Lewis pulled up a chair, sitting across from him, forearms on his knees. He wasn't there to give orders. He was there to listen. "The first time I had to pull a trigger against a man, I thought I'd feel different afterward," Lewis began, voice calm but filled with weight. "I thought I'd feel proud, powerful, maybe even vengeful, but in the end I just felt silence." Ethan finally lifted his eyes. He knew exactly what his father meant. "I didn't think it would be like this." Lewis nodded. "No, one does." Ethan took a shaky breath, searching for the right words. "I get why we did it. I know it had to be done, but that doesn't make me feel better about it." Lewis studied him for a moment before replying. "That means you're still human." Ethan looked away, absorbing that. "What if one day I stop feeling like this?" Lewis leaned in a bit, eyes intense. "Then that'll be the day you need to stop." They let the silence stretch out, but it was different now. A silence of understanding, of acceptance. Ethan felt, for the first time, that his father truly understood what was happening inside him. He wasn't alone in it. Lewis squeezed Ethan's shoulder reassuringly before standing up. "Your mother's worried about you. Don't let this shadow weigh on her too." Ethan nodded, exhaling. He still didn't know how to let it go, but at least he knew he wasn't carrying it alone. Lewis closed the door softly behind him, knowing his son needed space, time to heal. But the world outside wouldn't stop turning. The war in Thunder Creek was over, but the real battle, learning to live afterward, had only just begun. Morning arrived with a clear sky and a gentle wind rolling over the golden fields of the McCann farm. The land seemed to be trying to reset, to recover from the storm. But within the house, inside those who had fought to protect it, there still lay a heavy silence, something that couldn't be blown away with the breeze or warmed by the sun. Lewis got up early, as usual, but he didn't check the fences or tend the livestock. He headed into town. Ethan slept late, exhausted by the past nights. Martha said nothing as Lewis left, only nodding silently. She knew that no matter how much she wanted it, she couldn't stop him from being who he was. Thunder Creek looked the same, but at the same time, nothing was the same. Lewis sensed it in the way people watched him as he drove down the narrow streets. No more contempt, no more dismissive glances. There was respect, a respect mixed with apprehension. They knew what he'd done. They knew a gang of men tried to take his land, and now those men were gone. Lewis parked by Ruby's diner and got out. As he walked in, conversation died down. Some folks pretended to be busy with their cups of coffee, others avoided his eyes. He didn't care. He wasn't there to be accepted. Ruby, a woman, with grey-streaked hair and a face lined by time, watched him approach the counter, her expression impossible to read. Finally, she lowered her gaze and continued wiping the counter. "So you really did all that?" Lewis pulled out a chair and sat, leaning on the table with forearms atop it. "I did what had to be done," Ruby sighed, setting a mug of black coffee in front of him. "And now?" Lewis wrapped his hands around the mug, rotating it slowly. That was the question he'd been asking himself. Now the town decides if it wants to stay the same or change. Ruby let out a humorless laugh, crossing her arms. "You think Thunder Creek can change, Ike Lewis? Think a few dead men and one running from town is going to wipe away what we've always been?" Lewis raised the mug to his lips, swallowing the bitter coffee. "No, but they won't try to take what isn't theirs anymore. That's a start." Ruby studied him for a moment, then exhaled. "You've got more people on your side than you think, but there's a lot of fear, too. People grew up knowing Thunder Creek had invisible owners, that if Danton didn't run things, another just like him would come along." Lewis set the mug down and looked her in the eye. "Then it's time to show them this town doesn't need owners." Ruby watched him carefully, then shook her head, almost smiling. "Maybe Thunder Creek needs a man like you." Lewis didn't respond. He didn't see himself as a savior, just a man who did what was needed. Lewis spent the rest of the day watching and listening. He saw the store owners talking in hushed voices, the farmers exchanging concerned looks, families wondering what it meant to live in a place suddenly without a man like Danton pulling the strings. He saw Sheriff Riggins sitting on the station, steps smoking a cigarette, face worn with fatigue. As Lewis approached, Riggins didn't even stand. So, Danton's gone. People know. Lewis folded his arms, waiting. Riggins exhaled smoke. "The court might still try something against you, but without Danton to grease the wheels, and without the vultures to back him up, I think it'll all just go away." Lewis nodded. Shard not fully satisfied, but relieved. The sheriff stubbed the cigarette out on the wooden steps, looking Lewis in the eye. What now? Lewis looked around at the town. He saw men avoid his gaze, others give him discreet nods, some whisper in doorways. He saw Thunder Creek waiting. "I'm staying." The sheriff let out a wry laugh. "You know you're the one calling the shots here now, right?" Lewis shook his head slowly. "I don't want to rule. I want this town to stand on its own." Riggins stared at him for a few moments, then gave a sideways smile. "Good luck, McCann." Lewis gave a small nod and walked back to his truck. He didn't know if Thunder Creek was ready to change, but if it wasn't, he'd see to it that it did. When he returned home at sundown, he found Ethan on the porch, staring out at the fields. The boy looked older than his years. Lewis climbed the steps slowly and sat next to him. They didn't speak for a while, just watched the sky darken and the stars start to shimmer over the land. Ethan finally broke the silence. "I never thought it would end like this." Lewis exhaled quietly. "Things never end the way we imagine." Ethan nodded, absorbing that. The battle was over, but the weight remained. "And now?" he asked, eyes on the horizon. Lewis watched his son, realizing that was the question he would carry for the rest of his life. "Now, we learn to live with what's left." Ethan turned and studied his father, as if looking for some answer still not found, and for the first time, Lewis saw a man in those eyes. Not just a boy, not just his son, but a man. Lewis gently squeezed Ethan's shoulder. The war in Thunder Creek was over, but the real fight to rebuild was just beginning. Dawn brought a sky of fire over Thunder Creek, painting the McCann farm's golden fields with warm and somber hues. The wind blew softly, carrying the smell of damp earth and the hint of a new start. Yet for Lewis, there were no true restarts, only continuations. He had won, his family was safe, but the world didn't stop, so victors could rest. Life simply went on, indifferent to the wreckage left behind. Lewis drank his black coffee on the porch, eyes fixed on the horizon. The fences were mended, the aftermath of the battle cleaned up, but something in him still bore the mark of what happened. It wasn't the cuts and bruises that would fade in time. It was the knowledge that, willingly or not, he had become, again, the man he once tried to leave behind. The door creaked open behind him. Ethan stepped out, yawning, hair tousled with sleep, but eyes more alert than ever. He, too, was changed. He was no longer the boy who looked at his father uncertainly, wondering who he really was. Now, he understood. "You sleep?" Lewis asked, not looking away from the horizon. Ethan sat in the chair beside him, elbows on his knees, gaze on the fields. A little. "You!" Lewis gave a low chuckle, almost without humor. "Enough." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, acceptance. For years, Ethan had tried to figure out his father's secrets, the reason for his silence, the weight he carried. Now he no longer had to ask. At last, he understood. Inside, Martha prepared breakfast, pots and pans clinking softly. She still moved with caution, always glancing to the two men she loved, yet knew would never be the same. She accepted. Them styes but feared what they might become. Lewis took another sip of coffee, letting the warmth flow down his throat, then spoke. "You don't have to stay, Ethan." The boy frowned, rolling the metal watch on his wrist. "What do you mean?" Lewis set the mug down. "The farm will always be your home, but that doesn't mean you have to spend the rest of your life here. You still have choices." Ethan dropped his gaze momentarily. He had thought of it before all this. He dreamed of leaving, going to college somewhere else. Now he wasn't sure. What if I don't want to go? Lewis inhaled, feeling the breeze on his face. "Then you need to be ready for what that means." Ethan met his father's eyes and recognized what those words entailed. Staying meant bearing the weight of being a McCann, the legacy of a man who would always be tested, challenged, accepting that if he stayed, he could never afford to be weak. Martha came out, drying her hands on her apron. She saw Lewis and Ethan on the porch, trying to read the silent conversation they were having. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Are you two going to eat or spend all morning staring at the horizon?" Lewis gave a small smile, getting to his feet, stretching. There was something comforting in the simple routines of the farm, even after all they'd been through. "We're coming, Martha." Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, faces drifting over the sunlit fields. He felt it. This was home. Even after everything, maybe especially after everything. He stood and followed his father inside, feeling for the first time that he belonged. Thunder Creek would never be the same, but Lewis McCann would remain the last man standing.
Hi, I'm Mark Bianco, the writer and narrator of most of the stories you see here on the channel. I've handpicked 2 incredible stories for you to watch next. They're right here on the left side of your screen. Click and enjoy. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's story about veterans and law enforcement officers who help make our country what it is. See you in the next tale.